The leaders now need to have better communication, better arguments, an understanding of defense investment is not just about jobs. It's about why our countries are worth defending. What is the military for? Unless you are a pacifist, you should have some kind of political value that justifies the existence and use of a military force. Then what is it? So you have to go beyond the jobs argument for why defense investment is good or necessary. So jobs is, of course, is part of it, but it's not the most convincing one for many people and voters.
Hey SpaceWatchers, and welcome to our series of reflections on 2025. And today I have the pleasure to welcome Professor Bleddyn Bowen, Associate Professor at the Durham University, to our Space Café Radio. Bleddyn, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, Torsten. Thanks very much for having me back on the show. It's good to be back.
You just said you have been on this show, but maybe for our new audience that is growing by the day, you can introduce yourself, and you also changed to Durham. So maybe you can shed a bit of a light what your research is about. And we haven't mentioned it so far, but you are also the author of the original Sin in Space.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Bleddyn Bowen, Associate Professor of Astropolitics at Durham University in the UK, and also a co-director of the Space Research Centre at Durham University, which was only formally launched in November last year. My expertise is in military space activities and international relations in outer space. And yes, thank you for plugging the second book already, titled Original Sin, Power, Technology and War in Outer Space, published by Hearst Publishers in the UK and the European Union, and with Oxford University Press globally as well. And that looks at the international political history of the space age and how the military origins of the space age still determine much of what goes on in the global space industry and space security today.
That was deliberately placed by me because it's a perfect segue into my first area I would like to discuss with you. Did 2025, the year we are now reflecting on, change how military planners should think about space as a domain of warfare?
I would say nothing specific has happened in 2025 that changes how I think military planners should view operations in space or space as a domain of warfare. I've been pretty consistent about what I think should be thought about outer space for over 10 years now. Nothing new in terms of what I think is the most important stuff going on or useful ideas from political and military theory to understand outer space. I think the biggest changes possibly in terms of how people have changed their view of space in terms of military practitioners has been just the realization of how important space is to military forces. It's no longer a niche subject. So since I've been very active in this field for over 10 years, the biggest change has been the creation of the US Space Force. And that really put military space matters and threats to space systems on the senior political and bureaucratic military mindset in a way that it just wasn't before, especially amongst European governments and militaries. So the US has been talking about these things for a long time, and Europe really wasn't talking about it in the same language. And compared to 20 years ago, Europe is now talking with more or less the same language, the same concepts, the same words to explain military space operations and the threats to space systems. So there has been that shift in the last few years in the way practitioners in military and policy circles talk about it. But I've been consistent in my views on it for a long time.
Okay. Is space still mainly a support domain for military operation, or is it becoming a battlefield on its own? Because that would be a fundamental shift. NATO declared space as a fifth warfighting domain, I think 2019, if I'm not mistaken. But I think what we see now in national strategies, especially in the last 4 months, that it's taking serious now. What is your view on that?
So in reality, it's always been both since we've had a space age. It's not a useful dichotomy, I don't think. The reason that space is a potential battlefield is because it is that supporting environment. If space was not that supporting environment, there'd be no point to shoot at anything in space or to disrupt or deny. So throughout the space age, and this is an argument I make in Original Sin, ever since we started putting useful stuff up there, or specifically the superpowers in the Cold War, they were already at work at various anti-satellite weapon systems or techniques or methods to disrupt the use of satellites should a war happen between those two superpowers. And those technologies have continued to spread ever since and have come and gone as well in fits and starts of development by different countries. There's not that clear dichotomy there, really. It's just that awareness and understanding of it has certainly increased, and the language has, yes, shifted. So you're right to say that, yes, NATO has significantly changed its language to be more in line with that of what the United States has been saying for a long time. But the strategic reality has been pretty much that for many decades already. You can look back at debates in the 1960s and 1970s in space and military strategy. It's the same concepts, the same language, the same debates about reliance on space systems, resilience of communications, etc. In reality, that dichotomy is not particularly useful. But it's important to note how the language with elites have changed because, 20 years ago, European governments were reluctant to admit that there were military uses for space systems at all. But that is separate to discussing reality.
It's interesting how you frame it, because I would argue that this second level of space powers, not the superpowers, but the smaller powers, is the UKs, the France, the Germanys of the world, are now also adapting to this language. We saw, if I'm not mistaken, last year at Paris at the World Space Business Week, the French military, the first time announced their, call it Guardian satellite, or a satellite with offensive space capabilities. Germany is actively looking into that, and even our Minister of Defense announced it in his placement of the 35 billion in September this year, and talked about offensive space capabilities, a language, a narrative that I haven't heard before in that clarity to the public audience. I know it was out for an informed audience since end 24, but again, to bring it so prominent to the public audience, I haven't seen that. So that is for me a dramatic shift.
In terms of the mentality and the attitudes and the policies of many European countries, yes, that shift is new, but that is different to the wider strategic situation in orbit, which many countries have developed different kinds of ASATs for a long time, whether they're hit-to-kill systems, missiles that go up into space, orbital maneuvering systems, or just electronic warfare, cyber operations against space. Those are quite old methods of disrupting satellite use as well. So that language, is new for European states, but it's not new in wider history of military space, which some countries have been much more well developed on those for much longer. So it's about separating the language and policy shifts which are happening right now in Europe versus the wider strategic reality that's always been there.
And doing the reality check for what we just said, so from a strategic point of view, how credible is Europe today as a military space actor?
First problem is, of course, defining what Europe is. Are we talking about the European Union? Are we talking about the European Space Agency or individual?
As we're talking about military, it can't be ESA. So take that out of the equation, but take continental Europe to stay there.
But this is so much of space technology has dual realities to them. So the technologies that are used can be used for also security. So I'm old enough to remember when Copernicus was called GMES, the Global Monitoring for Environment and Security. And yes, there was a huge political drama about the S in GMES, and then it was changed to Copernicus to avoid all that. But that's the reality, is that ESA has been pivoting more to being able to meet the European Union security policy objectives in space. And that is also euphemism for military. And the squeamishness that is around this is frankly astonishing given what's been going on in Europe for the past 10 plus years, to be honest. The fact that many parts of Europe are still reluctant to speak in that sort of language is damaging wider credibility, despite the more forward language we are now seeing in terms of counter-space operations in various European military space strategies, UK, France, Germany, even Switzerland as well now. So that credibility I think Europe is becoming more credible on that. It still has those political, institutional hangovers to deal with because it hasn't liked to talk about space security and defense or military matters traditionally. But in terms of hard military capabilities or the tangible military capabilities, it's a wait and see story for now. What is damaging a lot of credibility for me at the moment is the continuing, well, we're still waiting for the European Union and the United Kingdom to make a wider defense arrangement between them. I would have thought that Russia redrawing the map in Europe and 10,000 North Korean troops in Europe would focus minds a bit. But no, we still have the same arguments about whose defense industries gets what money for X amount of buy-in from the British, etc. If that's not going to really force Britain and the European Union and the member states of the EU to come to a new accommodation, because the British defence industry is one of the few things we can tangibly offer to the EU in that wider relationship, I don't know what is. So that credibility is being damaged there about the long-term rearmament of Europe, which we have to do. So there's that on the EU level. We're still waiting to hear on the specific look of Iris Squared. That's still ongoing, and fair enough, it's a big project and it shouldn't be rushed, but I'd like to see a bit more haste because, it's needed. Then GovSatcom has gone a bit quiet. I haven't heard much, but that's about pooling existing resources. And I wonder, I don't know for a fact, but I wonder how much that is being factored into all this new huge spending we're seeing on SATCOMs by individual European states now in terms of a possible EU pooling or contribution mechanism for the new assets that specific countries will have to offer to the GovSatcom architecture. And then there's space tracking and surveillance systems, or SST or SSA, Space Situational Awareness, or SDA, Space Domain Awareness. Pick whichever acronym you want. Different people prefer different ones. I don't really care which one it is. Just surveilling the space environment and knowing what is going on in the space environment, who's doing what, who's flying where with what. Those technologies and capabilities, rather, still it needs a lot of investment by the EU or individual European countries, because we are so reliant on the Americans for basic space tracking and surveillance information. If you want to have a better understanding of what is going on up there, you need to have better data and analytics to make sense of it. We need to do a lot more there, especially if the European Union is serious about more EU autonomy in that regard. There's no point putting all that fancy stuff up in space if you're totally reliant on the Americans for traffic data in space and potential threat coming your way.
But on that point, I would argue that there is not even an European defense system, a common European defense system on the SSA side. We have EU SST, but that's a pure civilian system for now. What I understood is that in the next MFF and the multi-annual framework of the EU, there will be a line item for an SST Gov version, like we have seen it in Galileo PRS, or even the government version of Copernicus. I just forgot the acronym for that. But we see this willingness of member states, of ESA member states now, we are back on the ESA level, to invest in the ERS system, the European Resilience for Space. So what seems to be more or less the glue between all these systems. So I think it's very unspecific, at least from my understanding. But you mentioned at the beginning, not all member states, not all European countries are talking about it with the same language. Which countries did you have in mind that are not seeing space with the same relevance than the others?
I wouldn't say space is same relevance, and it's more about silence rather than those that aren't saying anything much on it. But I think largely as well through NATO, all NATO member states have by default agreed to that language. But I think more in terms of defense and security, so not space particularly, you have the apologists for Russia. You have naivety in defense and security thinking, we don't need to invest in defense capabilities if a ceasefire is imminent in Ukraine. That makes no sense whatsoever. Thinking that if the fighting will stop soon in Ukraine, then we don't need to spend any more money on defense. Just that sort of nonsensical military commentary from certain practitioners in Europe. So I don't want to be any more specific than that at this point.
Allow me this blunt question, but who are you referring to?
Well, I think it was in the news over the last week or two, especially over the issue on the loans for the Ukrainian budget, and certain countries very reluctant to release certain funds and worried about investment on more defense and escalating the situation with Russia.
Let's talk, and you alluded to that already, the change in the national or the update of the national strategies and a little bit on the real power. So Germany, France, Switzerland, Sweden, and the states have updated their space and security strategies in 2025. And where do you see the clearest tasking from a strategy into military powers? Because the strategy is something what is nice, what is written words somewhere in the bookshelf, and then how to get it into reality.
I don't think any strategy documents ever do that because they're not the acquisition decisions. They're usually made outside of those strategy documents. So
not even the German strategy got to this point that you have been happy? Because they put in this annex with the tasking. And I think that was, for me, definitely new to see. So, but it didn't satisfy you.
It's about actual constellation architectures and makeups, and those are to come. And the strategy documents are, again, for a wider audience, and it's about setting the tone. And the German one in particular, yes, set a new tone, but I'm waiting to see exactly where that 35 billion euros is going to end up. And yeah, we'll wait and see what comes out of that process. I know in the British case, these large strategy documents tend to a lot of things, but it gives us no indication of what big decisions are being discussed at the time or will be decided in the very near future. So, for example, during the Conservative government, the Defence Space Strategy was published in 2022, and at no point was the new dark radar really mentioned as a forthcoming new investment for the UK. Or was it the 2021 National Space Policy? I forget exactly when it was decided, but the dark radar, the military radar that was going to be based in Wales, in Pembrokeshire, was not teased in the big policy or strategy documents before it was announced outside of such a document, even though it is possibly the biggest new ground station for the British military in terms of space capability in a couple of generations. So large acquisition decisions are not decided in these documents. I see them as, setting the scene and giving bureaucrats and politicians and ministers and journalists as well the talking points and the language to understand maybe the framings and the general thinking around them.
Let's talk money and the military effect of it. So we spoke about the German announcement. We are touched on the ESA 22.3 billion euro budget. So do these numbers change Europe's military position in space?
I think it'll definitely make European countries rather more credible. It'll eventually, whenever they're fielded, it will take time. But it's not just about putting the satellites in space. It's having the people to actually build them and then also operate them and make good use of them. So even for the parts of the military forces and government offices and security services that doing space activities, they will need to know what is available to them to use now with all these new capabilities in a way that they may not have before. There will be many parts of the states that will be using perhaps American systems, and they can maybe more easily start switching to domestic or European level systems. But there will be all sorts of opportunities from new satellite infrastructures that will just take time for people to learn how to use and know what's there now that they're developed in-house, as it were, rather than maybe commissioned or tasked or provided by, namely, the United States. So, this over the long term, this should start reducing European reliance on the United States, especially for tactical intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities, which, as we saw earlier this year, really caused problems for the Ukrainians when the Americans pulled the plug on intelligence support and really caused problems for the Ukrainians on the battlefield.
I would say we have taken this lesson, not just the articulated lesson by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, but also the circumstances that you just are referring to. And I think Europe has a willingness to overcome that dependency of from the state. So, but a nasty question potentially. So, what capabilities still cannot be bought with money?
I think that it's political coherence and stability. You can't do that with new military capabilities. So the real problems facing Europe now really is on the political side. So you look at Britain, France and Germany. All of the incumbent parties are struggling. Their heads of government or heads of state are in particularly weak political positions or struggling. In the United Kingdom here, Keir Starmer is looking at very difficult devolved elections in May in 2026. and a possible leadership challenge. And I know your listeners will be much more familiar with the German and French political instability at the moment there than I am. So that sort of stuff is not something a single budget is going to address. And you need political narratives that make sense of what they're doing. The leaders need to have better communication, better arguments, an understanding of defense investment is not just about jobs. It's about why our countries are worth defending. What is the military for? Unless you are a pacifist, you should have some kind of political value that justifies the existence and use of a military force. Then what is it? So you have to go beyond the jobs argument for why defense investment is good or necessary. So jobs is, of course, is part of it, but it's not the most convincing one for many people and voters. And a lot of voters aren't pacifist. It's not like you're trying to convince the majority of people to not be pacifists, even in countries that do have a stronger pacifist tradition. So that sort of stuff is, money can't buy you that. It can't buy you good political leadership and communication. And then more widely at the European level, and we're seeing it now with the fraught negotiations, if we can call them negotiations, about Ukraine and Russia's invasion. Europe is so divided on it now. We have certain countries in Europe who are pushing the pro-Russian line, and it's hamstringing a collective European effort. No single country's defense budget can deal with that.
I hear you.
Other things have to deal with it.
I think on the Ukraine situation, we see a coalition of the willing or of the big power rather than in EU. EU was present in the talks here in Berlin earlier this week, but even more in a listener or observer position than others. So I think the power triangle or quartet, including Italy, France, and UK and Germany, made its point. And what you said earlier on the pacifist thing, Germany just reintroduced an obligatory military services. And guess what? People were protesting against that. And I thought, okay, guys, what is wrong? So why don't you see what's going on 1,000 kilometers away from us? It's not on the other side of the world. It is here. It's our home continent where that's happened. And it's not that we are separated on an island. No, we are in the middle of Europe, and still people don't see it and believe that with nice words and white flags, we can stop this war.
No. And it's that lack of sort of convincing political leadership, which also can't be divorced from the rise of the far right across Europe. Some of those parties are very much taking their lines from the Kremlin. And when you get into the question of defense and values, talk about liberal democracy, protection of minorities, all things which some European centrist governments have been trying to pander to the far right to and going against, undermining their own possible narratives for why do we want to do more defense spending? Why do we want to do more? Why should people pick up arms for their countries when they're actually giving in to the far right narratives and talking points, which some people would argue undermining what would be a liberal democracy ought to stand for. So I think a re-evaluation of basic political values as the far right rises, and seemingly the United States has been captured by far right forces as well. It's a very troubling time. And yet, if not this, then what will stir Europe into taking its own defense seriously? I don't know.
Was the J.D. Vance speech here in Munich or the released national security strategy of the US showing clear picture how US is seeing Europe a wake-up call for us in Europe to even speed up our activities in terms of independence, sovereignty? How do you see that?
That struck me as similar to the old Brezhnev doctrine, where the Soviet Union reserved the right to meddle in the internal affairs of socialist states to Moscow's design. And it seems that the current US administration wants to be able to meddle in the internal affairs of the democratic states to bring about more populist far-right parties that align to the current administration's values on freedom of speech, etc., what they call freedom of speech, and various women's rights and minority rights of different kinds. So it's very troubling, but it's areas where, again, it's political leadership that has to deal with that and providing a convincing narrative to electorates, because the economic decline of Europe is proceeding and the popularity of these far-right parties is a symptom of that as well. So it's a real difficult challenge that, again, space is just a part of that larger story, and the rise in space and defense spending is a symptom of the deteriorating economic and security environments that Europe is finding itself in.
I would like to close with an outlook into 2026 and preparing my question. I'm a bit afraid of the answer that I might get now from you. What is the most likely military space scenario Europe is not preparing for in 2026?
I don't know is the honest and short answer to that, as what exactly has been prepared for or anticipated is, of course, something that's not often said out in public or spelled out. These things are very sensitive, so it's hard to say what hasn't been prepared for, really, on top of there are clear capability gaps. Europe will not be able to respond to everything because it physically doesn't have the kinds of capabilities that China or United States already has in space. But generally speaking, you're looking at various disruptions to right now. Galileo or GPS, we're not seeing or we're not hearing how Galileo has been factoring into making up for GPS loss in certain areas. We hear a lot about how GPS keeps getting jammed. If Galileo works as it should, then that signal should come in as backup, especially in Europe, shouldn't it? I've never understood that about some of the news reporting about GPS jamming, especially for civil and commercial jamming. So I'm not talking about the military signal and GPS here. So how far has the backups for or resilience aspect of Galileo been rolled out across European critical infrastructure should something happen to GPS and make it unusable, especially for civil and commercial users? So that will be one. A weakness that Europe has as well is on basically its entire dependence on the United States for advanced military space capabilities. So all the investments we're seeing now, they will take time to come online. And even then, they're not going to be at the same scale as what the United States can field by itself. So no single European state will have the same scale of capabilities as China, Russia, or the United States. And yeah, a real problem is what happens if the US administration decides at some critical moment to pull the plug on information it shares with European militaries. And you said earlier that prospect is something that has been noted and taken seriously since earlier in 2025. And I couldn't quite believe when the Americans did that to the Ukrainians myself. So that is something that, yeah, you can see that in the response, but how far you can deal with that next year is a real question, because the new European capabilities is going to take time to get online. And also corralling what Europe already feels in space into a seamless military ISR system is difficult. Europe already has a lot in space. Thinking of the existing ISI radar satellites, the French imagery satellite systems at Spot, for example. We can look at a lot of other communication systems as well. There's a lot of stuff up there, but they're not necessarily seamlessly integrated for European militaries to be able to use in a way that will make a difference. If something happens, say, on the Suwalki Gap by Kaliningrad in Poland, if something happens there, and that's the moment when critical space services support is actually withheld for whatever reason. So I'm particularly concerned about the Baltics. And as Europe gets its act together, the situation will get harder for Russia to do anything about over the next few years. And we'll have to wait and see if any pause in the fighting is reached in Ukraine as well. So yeah, it's difficult to outline a specific space scenario because so many different things can go wrong in different ways. But yeah, having capabilities that can be resilient, that can come in if space systems go dark. So the UK is bringing back the ELORAN system, so ground-based radio beacon location technologies, which we used to have around ports and airports once upon a time before GPS came to do everything for us. The UK is bringing that back. And so that's very useful for fixed sites. You can look at other kinds of resilient ground-based systems to make up for satellite loss. They can't do everything, but it's good to have the backups and that resiliency and the stuff you can do in your own territories as well. So having more systems that can plug different gaps or be good enough in a disaster is what you need. And that language is there, of course, in all these documents. So I think the memo on that has gotten through.
I see. And I understand the scenario that you described, especially as we recorded here on the 18th of December this morning. In the German news, at least, it was reported that there have been seen a gray man coming over the river in Estonia, if I'm not mistaken. But it was a very foggy picture, but I hope that the sources are reliable. That's something what we don't know, but we will potentially see in the evening news. Then I thank you very much for your time and your reflection on 2025. And I'm looking forward to working with you next year. And I wish you a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
And Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to you as well, and see you in 2026.
If you have further questions, reach out to us at radio@SpaceWatch.Global. If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Thorsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.